That line kills me of like, let's just play school. It's like the 1986 version of like, ma'am, this is a Wendy's. Hi, my name is Mary Mahoney, and welcome to the first episode of Landline, the podcast where pop culture gets some context. I often call myself a millennial with too many interests and not enough friends willing to pick up the phone, so Landline felt like the perfect name for a show where I'll call up guests to help me unpack things happening online, in books, movies, music, celebrity gossip, and more with history. I often use history to understand pop culture, and that's what I'll do on this show. For my first guest, I asked Colette Dion Montoya, an Indigenous researcher and librarian, to help me unpack a topic I'm really curious about. A few years ago, American Girl, a brand whose books made me want to be a historian and or a low-key sociopath like Molly McIntyre, my favorite character, quietly put out revised copies of some of their original books. The iconic brand, dating back to 1986, had been envisioned as a means to get girls interested in history and to see themselves at the center of the story. Is this why so many millennial women have main character energy? Anyway, one of these three original dolls, Kirsten Learns, was described as a pioneer who would have fit in with the era's embrace of the West from a white perspective. Other entries from this era include Dances with Wolves, Fievel Goes West, The Oregon Trail Game, and Far and Away, a movie starring Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman that's ostensibly about the immigration experience, but really about the trauma of being married to Tom Cruise. Kirsten's story fits a type of pioneer arc. It's a story of a family who emigrated from Sweden, survived rough travel to Minnesota, where they face a myriad of challenges to settle and survive in their new home. Kirsten also allowed a raccoon into their house and then burnt it down, but that's not what we're here to discuss today. Kirsten Learns a Lesson is the second book in the 6-book series, and one that was revised recently by American Girl. In it, Kirsten meets an Indigenous girl called, quote, an Indian friend named Singing Bird. They meet up and play together and somehow communicate without language. Kirsten is even christened with the name, quote, Yellow Hair by Singing Bird's father, the chief. Kirsten takes comfort in Singing Bird's friendship as she begins to learn English and attend school. At the end of the story, Singing Bird's family voluntarily leaves Minnesota, just as Kirsten describes the area as her, quote, home. What was American Girl hoping to change about this original story, and how successful were they in doing it? That's what Colette and I are trying to find out. Okay, Colette, my friend, I'm so happy that you could be on the show. I'm so delighted to always talk to you about all things American Girl and just everything in life, but thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I was just thinking, this is our third time recording a podcast episode together, and this is my third apartment to do it in.
Wow. What a wild life you live, Colette. I'm so excited you could join me all the way from Toronto. To talk about a topic that is near and dear to both of our hearts, American Girl, and specifically kind of the politics of commemoration. So for those who may not know who are listening, American Girl is going to be celebrating its 40th anniversary, which is a shock because I was born the same year as American Girl. And I refuse to acknowledge that milestone, Colette. But, with commemorations, with anniversaries comes, reassessment, re-engagement, renegotiation with your own history. American Girl is no different. One of the things that you and I have been interested in is new editions of some of the original books that have come out with some changes. So I invited you on today to talk about one of those books and kind of this whole concept of revising previous content. Where are you at with this?
Well, so this reissued book, I think they started doing it last year, maybe even the year before. American Girl started re-releasing the classic dolls in their original clothing, kind of these like commemorative editions, like collector editions. And then some very astute fans, not myself, noticed that several of the books had either the text or looking back sections updated. And I'm really fortunate that I was able to get family to, come to my aid. Now that I'm in Canada, it's harder for me to get American Girl products. and made sure I got my copy. So yeah,
Yes.
it's fascinating to me because I read, I read the first edition of Kirsten Learns a Lesson. I first discovered American Girl in 1988. So I was 5, and now I'm in my early 40s. But let me reassure you, it's true. Like, your 40s are the best. I feel like
Oh, thank you for that.
yeah, you'll know. I feel like, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like I'm settled in who I am and integrating my values and my sense of self. And I feel
Mm.
better about my own choices. And I feel like I know how to make the choices that are healthy for me, in terms of family and friends and the path that I want for myself. And as you are, coming upon that milestone, I know that's something that is blooming in your life too.
Thank you, Colette. That's so sweet. And, I wonder if American Girl, the brand, feels the same way, that maybe they are coming into a more settled version of who they see themselves as, not to make the mistake of confusing a corporation with a person, even though the law does. But, is this the version of themselves that they want to be? And I think it's interesting that there wasn't necessarily a huge rollout of these new editions or sort of a celebration of the edits that they made or the point of view that they took on. But they do include a note at the beginning of the edition that's worth talking about, to explain sort of what's guiding them. And we are going to get into the plot of this book in case if you've landed here and don't know anything about American Girl, we'll tell you what you need to know in a moment. But
Spoilers.
suffice it to say, yeah, there will be many spoilers. They include a page at the very beginning of this 2025 edition called About Our Stories. And in it, they say at one point, quote, "As we re-release our classic stories, first published in 1986, we've made some updates to language and imagery. We revised our looking back essays to give a broader context to the historical setting and themes in the story. We've also included additional resources and discussion questions for readers who want to learn more." Now, I'm already sort of, my ears perk up reading this when they say the thing we've updated is language and imagery.
Yeah. And I will say, going back to what you said about personal growth, I think
Mm-hmm.
American Girl's kind of in a hot mess era.
Oh, coming in
Um,
with a real hot take from the jump. Please say
hot mess.
more.
Well, not long ago, American Girl was headquartered in Wisconsin, and their research was based in Wisconsin for most of its history. And
Mm-hmm.
just a couple of years ago, they closed down that Wisconsin headquarters, and everything has moved now to Los Angeles under Mattel. They no
Mm-hmm.
longer report out American Girl's financials or research separately from Mattel, so you don't no longer have like this separate shareholder call. So it's more, there's more obfuscation around financials, but at the same time,
Mm.
we are seeing more of a push. Um, I think I would say superficial push towards acknowledging more diversity, but at the same time, I think they're aware of that a good portion of their consumer base are conservative, white Christians. And I wonder if that
Right.
plays a part in, like, also what happened politically last year with the regime change. If that's why they actually haven't even acknowledged these revisions that I'm aware of.
Which is really, really fascinating.
And the book is also not available. I don't believe that they have reissued the book for publication outside of what about coming with the Kirsten school outfit. So you have to buy this outfit that, if you are an older collector, you likely already have to get this
Right.
book.
Right. Yeah, it's very odd because this, to me, this revision, spoiler alert, is about a lot more than just changing certain word choices or certain imagery or scenes that we get in the 1986 original. To me, it's really an attempt to pivot or reassess the power dynamics between Indigenous peoples in this book and white settler colonists. Now, to what end we will get into, but I think it's about more than just we swapped some words here and there, which is sort of, there's a longer history of revising children's books to update them to meet changing norms. So this is not a new thing for American Girl. Little House on the Prairie, which you know more about, has done this, which we can get into. But also the Boxcar Children, early editions used to describe their father as an alcoholic, and then that was cut.
Oh, I didn't know that. I mean,
Um,
I read those as a kid, but I think like only the first 15 or something were part of the original series, so I only read those.
I love that you have that stat ready to go. I was obsessed with those books because they're set in Connecticut, which is where I'm from and still live. And we only have certain, fictional towns to cling to, Colette. We have Stony Brook, the imagined town of the Babysitters Club, not a real town. We
Blackbird
have
Pond.
Stars Hollow. Yes, Blackbird Pond. I love the Witch of Blackbird Pond. It's not a real pond. Weathersfield is a real place. Stars Hollow, not a real place. There's 3 towns that claim that they're the basis of Stars Hollow. Who knows? But so, I have to know my Boxcar Children trivia. But apart from that, and this is sort of a cutesy one or like a more positive one, is in Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Judy Blume participated in a revision to update period language to get rid of sanitary belt and talk about tampons and so on.
Yeah, well, even when I read that in the early 90s, I remember being like, what?
Me too. I was already scared and I was like, wait, what are we talking about? A belt?
And I'm the oldest girl. So like, I knew I was going to have to be, the one to
teacher, preacher. Yeah.
But no.
But coming back to American Girl. So just in case you've landed here from outer space, you don't know American Girl at all, we'll give you just some off the dome. This is what you need to know. It's an educational toy brand invented by Pleasant Rowland in 1986. She issues 3 dolls to start: Samantha, Kirsten, and Molly. All of the dolls come with a book, and it's imagined to invite children, originally girls, to connect with America's history through play and through storytelling. So setting these girls' lives at different moments in American history. And Kirsten Larson is set in 1854. She's a Swedish immigrant who immigrates with her family from Sweden to Minnesota.
And then we get Felicity in 1991, who's white, and then we don't get our first doll of color, Addie, until 93.
Mm-hmm.
And then we don't get our first Indigenous doll until 2002 with Kaya.
Yes.
So as a child, like I first encountered these books in first grade through Bookette, which is kind of full circle because now the 90s dolls have a Bookette set, which is weird.
Surreal.
But I really loved Renee Graff's illustrations. They're beautiful.
Yes, they're gorgeous.
And I think of all of the American Girl books, they're just cozy and like she's so talented. There was something that really drew me in about the illustrations. But even as a child, I remember reading Kirsten Learns a Lesson and being like, this is odd because she's got this Indian friend, right? But how are they're talking to each other, but how are they, it's very unclear how even they do a lot of this communication where they're drawing like pictures in the sand. I'm like, how do they even know what those motifs mean?
Yes.
But also Singing Bird, her Indian friend, is depicted as like also fair skinned and with kind of light brown hair. So that's something that it would be so fascinating to delve into. Like, is it because of the softer colors in Renee Graff's art, or is this kind of like a subtle nod to the fact that Singing Bird herself is mixed?
Wow. Okay. Let me hit pause on that for one moment. I do want to dive into the book and your hot take on it. But first, let's just zoom out for 1 second. So Kirsten Learns a Lesson is the book we're going to be talking about. It's the second book in the series. And the plot of this book, there's basically 2 plot lines. The first plot line that's more Kirsten centered is that she goes to school at a 1-room schoolhouse. She's still learning English. They've just arrived. She's already lost her best friend, R.I.P. Marta. Not even going to go there. Traumatic friend death in book 1. But she goes to the 1-room schoolhouse with Miss Winston, never forget, who is, basically an icon. And she is tasked with memorizing 4 lines of a poem. And that is traumatic for her as someone who is learning English and acclimating to just going to school in general and being in a whole new place. And by the end of the book, spoiler alert, Miss Winston changes the lines that she gives her and gives her instead 4 lines from a poem about being on the ocean on a ship, which reminds Kirsten of her recent immigration journey. She performs the poem flawlessly. She gets a reward of merit, a piece of paper acknowledging her success. Plotline like B, but actually our number 1 plotline that we're going to talk about today is that Kirsten, without telling anyone in her life seemingly, befriends an Indigenous girl named Singing Bird, who's a member of the Dakota Nation. And
it should be noted that she actually isn't assigned a nation.
Oh.
She doesn't. The first reference to Singing Bird's tribe isn't until the late 90s. They bring it up in a subsequent short story. So that's one of the things they add.
Wow. Oh, because she's just called, quote, Indian friend.
The Indian girl. So
the
she's
Indian,
not,
yeah, you're
depending
right.
on
Wow.
how we're encountering her, she's Dakota or she's Indian.
Yes. And thank you for that. And basically, they have a secret relationship where they keep encountering each other by a stream. They leave each other little gifts. They're allegedly communicating by drawing images in the sand on the side of the river or stream.
And they somehow just teach each other words, but it's unclear how they communicate this.
It's unclear how that happens. Singing Bird invites Kirsten to what's called her village, which is interesting. And Kirsten goes, there's a very cringe scene where she imagines being Singing Bird's sister and is invited to seemingly join the tribe. And then after this, Singing Bird meets her up with her and says, we're leaving because there's no food. You should come. And Kirsten thinks about this and then realizes she would miss her family and declines.
And but also she's American now, right? This is her new identity.
Because she's American. She says, this is my home. She says, Minnesota, that's my home.
But it's that classic American way of defining yourself as American against
the
Indigenous.
Yes,
culture.
Absolutely. And these are just, and so then after that, Singing Bird disappears and says, I hope. Yes. But I mean, just in this book, disappears from the book after that point.
And she's you see her like waving in the distance, like, goodbye. We're food.
Yes, exactly. So that's the plot of the original book. And we want to both put in conversation that original plot line with the revisions made to it in this edition that came out more recently. So that's kind of, I just wanted to give that context before we dive into a more like granular conversation about it.
And I should also say that like there's significant changes to the looking back, the peek into the past.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, because there's no reference at all to Indigenous history in the peek into the past or looking back that appears in the back of every American Girl book, the historical books. And in the 1986 edition, absolutely no reference to Indigenous people in a book in which their history figures hugely, which is shocking. I mean, I was rereading this yesterday. I went and found my 1986 edition and I've reread this a couple years ago, but I'm still stunned by that. But so we're going to talk about the more recent edition, which does include Indigenous history into the peek into the past section and makes changes to the original text of the story. Where do we even begin with this, Colette?
Well, I think we should begin with, who were we then? This was a time period for me. I was pretty young, and I was living in Wisconsin at this time, which is, very close. It's the same milieu as Pleasant Company. And
yes,
in Minnesota, which is very close by, just next door. But I'm New Mexican, and I'm Pueblo. And I think I've told you this before, that I didn't understand myself as Indian or Native American. I knew I'm Pueblo. I knew I'm from my villages, Isleta and San Felipe. But I didn't really understand that I was Indian because we don't dress or act or look like the stereotypical image of Native Americans, Indians. And actually, when I was about this age, I asked my mom if I could be an Indian for Halloween.
Wow.
And my mom, I don't know how, I need to ask her like what she was feeling at that time. But she was like, and I remember her like explaining to me, you already are, like every day. And I was like, no, I'm not, but I don't have a pony, like can't shoot a bow and arrow. I don't have a friend named Yellow Hair who visits me by the stream.
Oh my God. Well, yeah. And what's interesting about that context is that you were also growing up at a time when white pop culture was really comfortable dressing in so-called Indian costume. Like I think about the episode of Saved by the Bell where Zach Morris is visited by his alleged Indigenous ancestor and then shows up to a school presentation about genealogy in like full like headdress outfit, and you're like, what in God's name is going on here?
I never I didn't have a TV as a kid, so I missed out on all those cultural references.
I mean, I'll send you the clip, but it's for the best probably that you didn't see it. Even as a child watching it, I was like, wait a second, we're supposed to believe that Zach has this sort of hidden Indigenous history. But I mean, that's kind of like
That's
the
what people think.
pretendian legacy that, we've all lived through. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That is what people think. And I think because that story is so common, a lot of folks don't question it. And people can feel really betrayed when they find out that those stories are really baseless.
Mm-hmm.
Often, I work in academia, and I've done a lot of work recently on how can institutions kind of safeguard their funds and community resources for people who are experiencing marginalization, because there is a spectrum. It's not like you're Indian or you're not, right? There are folks
Right.
like me who are Indigenous, who are raised in a community, who are like raised around their language and their traditions. And there are folks who are definitely Indigenous. They have Indigenous ancestry, but they may not know their communities. They may not know their languages, their clans. And so there's a definite gap there. And that isn't necessarily their fault. That is the deliberate result of cultural genocide on a part of the United States and Canada. But that kind of amorphous sense of connection does mean that there are huge numbers of people who are falsely claiming indigeneity, whether they know they are or not.
Mm-hmm.
And those situations can be really hard to deal with, because sometimes you do encounter folks who are like, they really thought that was their story and they're devastated. They're like, why did my family lie to me? And often like it's
Right.
not the first generation of a lie. Sometimes it's 4 or 5 generations. And sometimes, it's really painful, but a lot of Black families have this story as a way to protect themselves from segregation or Jim Crow laws that say, oh, we have Native ancestry, because if they said they were Black, then there would be pretty severe repercussions.
Right.
But I think there's a sense of ownership in American and in Canadian society where folks kind of feel like Indigenous cultures belong to them, even if they are not themselves Indigenous. And you can see that in both of these books.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? Where do you see it in the book?
Well, I think for myself, as I think about the way I came to interact with these books as an adult versus as a child, I've been doing some work lately on the ways that American Girl is kind of reworking how they relate to indigeneity specifically. But I would argue that while they did a lot of work in this new edition of Kirsten Learns a Lesson, it's not necessarily any better. It's just coded differently. So racism is really insidious. And the way that we talk about Indigenous peoples changes over time. Indians is used throughout the books. And I believe that in the first version of the book, it's not really acknowledged that that's what people used to call us. And even now, there's a lot of contention, even within Indigenous communities, over like, which word do you say? Which words are okay? And the kind of one thing I'd just like to share with everyone is just the most important thing to do is, if you know somebody's specific community, use that. And if you're using something respectful, great. And if someone says, actually, that makes me really uncomfortable, change it, respect that.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're not Indigenous, it's not your place to tell someone like how they should refer to themselves. But there is no consensus over whether Native American, Indigenous, American Indian, and it shifts a lot geographically and generationally. But I think that when they did this update, they were very cognizant of their primary audience still being white children and not being Indigenous children reading this book.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates with me because when I was rereading, I reread both editions, one right after the other, and was noting kind of choice passages that are different. And something that was really interesting is that in the original 1986 edition, in the scene where we first meet Singing Bird, she is described. Hold on, let me find this.
Chapter 3, right? Because we first talk about Elizabeth and Anna. They're in their secret fort.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And we should talk about that. But so first, we don't see Singing Bird. We just have a conversation about Native Americans in the area that it's sort of Kirsten's cousins letting her know what's up. And this is some of the most damaging language that gets changed in the new edition, or some of it. So they're having a moment of play after school, and her cousin is pretending she's Miss Winston, scolding the class. And she says, quote, "Remember, you are not savages like the Indians." And this is in the 1986 edition, which is pretty shocking to read.
It is, I think, but I also think it's kind of depressing to look back on, but I didn't clock this as a kid. This was the kind of language I heard regularly around me, even though my teachers, my peers, my neighbors were aware that my family is Indigenous. I'm talking about like non-native peers and neighbors, etc. And I would still hear this kind of language. Maybe, and it slipped in kind of casually, like here the conversation is deliberately like about, becomes about Indigenous people. But my mom has told this story about when I was pretty young, like a toddler, and we were, living on the East Coast. I think my parents were still in grad school, and someone said, "Oh, a bunch of us kids are playing out in front of the houses," and someone said, "Oh, stop running around like a bunch of wild Indians." And then she turns and looks at my mom and was like, "Oh, whoops,"
Oh my God.
or even how when I was a child, we still said like, now we say, "I'm going to sit crisscross applesauce." We'd say, "I'm going to sit Indian style."
Yep.
But some of these things have really changed for the better. It was really common for me as a kid when I wasn't in my own community to have kids do like the wah-wah thing where they're tapping their hand over the mouth. I don't think that children today are even aware of that.
I would hope not. Yeah, I would hope.
And I'm around kids regularly, but I don't think I think that's something that thankfully has stopped, but that's not to say that we're not still experiencing things like the Atlanta Braves or, all of these mascot behaviors are still occurring in culture. They're just shifting in different ways. And that's kind of what's happening in these books.
So in that same scene where Kirsten's sort of getting intel on her new home and new air quotes neighbors, and her cousin says, "Don't act savage like the Indians," there's then an explanation from Lisbeth, her other cousin, about what's a savage. And we get this explanation about sort of like the fear of Native Americans, where she says, quote, Lisbeth says, "Papa worries about the Indians. He says that if we plant crops on their hunting land, the wild animals will go away. He says the Indians won't have enough to eat then, and they'll surely be angry. I don't know. Papa says we need the land too." And so this is where I'm kind of saying there are more changes to this book than language and imagery, because that is an image that invites us to, that would not be out of place in an Oregon Trail video game. Or in other words, like the West exists for white people to extract people and resources. And, like we need land too. That's kind of the ball game. Like it's a defensive colonialism, not a lot of concern for how this is going to impact local Indigenous communities, kind of like the shift towards farming, taking of land on a very basic level, the stripping of resources. But that same passage in the newer edition, Kirsten asks why the Dakota are hungry. So already we're talking about them as the Dakota. Savage is removed from the passage. And it says, "Papa says the government made a treaty with the Dakota. They promised to pay the Dakota for their land, but they haven't done it. They promised food and supplies too, but the Dakota haven't received much." And Anna says, "I'd be angry if people didn't pay me for something I sold them." And Kirsten says, "Why can't we treat the Dakota fairly?" And there's no real answer to this other than Anna saying, "I'm glad Mama was kind to the Dakota man." And it's a reference to an incident where Anna's mom gave some meat to a Dakota man who appeared at her door.
The way that the two versions end, it's actually really similar. It's just, again, shifted. So in the first one, right,
yes.
Papa says we need the land too. But Kirsten doesn't actually interact with it. We just go immediately to Kirsten saying, "Oh, but did the Indians live in their tents all winter? Don't they get cold?" asked Kirsten. "I don't know," Elizabeth said. "You're too curious, Kirsten. Let's just play school." So there we've kind of just got like the text is not dealing with it at all. It's just kind of like, well, we don't know what to do with this.
That line kills me of like, let's just play school. It's like the 1986 version of like, "Ma'am, this is a Wendy's," where it's just basically like, this is not the space for that kind of questioning. Like, we're not going there.
And it's also just kind of haunting, right? Because while Kirsten and her siblings are like, they're struggling to like I think that, in this fourth book, Kirsten stops going to school because she needs to help her mom with the new baby.
Mm-hmm.
But meanwhile, what's happening to Indigenous kids is that the boarding school era is ramping up in the US and Canada. The Dakota Wars are about to begin, and children are being kidnapped and
Yes.
forced into work camps, essentially. Schools is not a proper term. So this book, Kirsten is learning these lessons at home, and she's learning the lessons at school. But the reality is, for Singing Bird or her children, that they're going to be incarcerated when they encounter
Yes.
Indian agents, and that is not there. So then we go over to the second book, right? She's like, why can't we treat the Dakota fairly, right? And here you can see how I can kind of imagine like a boardroom or a work grouping, like, oh, that previous response, like that diversion is really awkward for everybody in retrospect,
Mm-hmm.
40 years later, 40 plus years later, because I'm sure this was written long before that. So then we have Anna, Lisbeth, and Kirsten thinking. They're thoughtfully, they're pondering, at least getting there, right? Like, what's our culpability in all of this?
Mm-hmm.
But we're not quite there yet. And at the same time, these are books written for children.
Yeah, I mean, that is an added wrinkle to all of this, which is how do you distill really complicated histories for children to be able to understand? And yet, I think there would be a way to tell the story, which makes clear that, the process of Americanization that Kirsten and her family are undergoing is going to be profitable for them. It's voluntary. It will allow them to enter the class of people who's subjugating others around them. So her Singing Birds community, like the process Singing Birds community is going to undergo, is extremely violent and not voluntary. And I think there would be a way to tell this story that brings in the history of the boarding school movement, which is happening now. I mean, the lack of violence in this book is definitely a choice because, and I think that's the most puzzling piece of the story. Like, yes, I understand not wanting to maybe expose children readers to a violent history, but it's what happened. So, I mean, it's really a choice to have Singing Bird and her community leave voluntarily their own ancestral lands at the end of this book.
Because they're hungry and there isn't enough food. And there isn't enough food, enough work. And they mention that in the first book. That's why they're coming. But there's no internal monologue. There's no understanding of Kirsten, like, oh, we left because there wasn't enough. What were the forces at play that are causing the kind of a similar storyline to happen for Singing Bird, but there's no choice there for them.
Well, and also talking about, like, in the updated book, like, the government becomes part of the explanation that Kirsten is offered, and then she, uses towards the end of the book for the cause of some of their problems, but she's not including herself or her family within that. So the world of the government includes the people who are, subject to it, who are becoming citizens.
That's the whole American project, right? Is it's a democracy, and that means that everyone is sharing a responsibility. But here, it's kind of almost, it's like almost like a anti-big government look at it, right? It's the government that's hurting these Dakota people. They promised to pay, but they haven't done it. There's
no responsibility taken by Kirsten or her family for being part of that.
And the Dakota Wars happen. They're just right around this time. Laura Ingalls Wilder is also, happening in this, with her. She's born about 10 years after this book takes place. But the treaty was signed. The Dakota people were moved, and they were told that they were receiving rations. And what happened that kind of precipitated a lot of the violence was that the funding was delayed, and the Native people weren't given their checks, which they would have used to buy supplies from the settlers. And the settler merchants and the government decided they were not going to sell anything to the Indigenous peoples on credit. And it was, I forget his name, but the head of the fort or whatever, they're saying, well, what are they going to eat? What are they going to eat? And he said, let them eat grass. And then later that same person was murdered by Indigenous people and found with grass stuffed down his throat when he was killed. And I think one thing that's really frustrated me in being part of this fandom, I've been part of the American Girl Online fandom for more than 2 decades at this point, which is bizarre. But I've had encounters with fans who like, they really have a strong affiliation with these characters, and it's very difficult for them to look back at these books that were so formative and they have so much nostalgia about with any kind of critical eye. And there
Right.
are definitely apologist folks in the fandom, and from interacting with them, I know that they're rational people, but when it comes to this, intellectual property that they feel so strongly about, it's really hard for them to admit that a Pleasant Company or Janet Shaw or anyone involved in the production of these books would have been at fault. And that's bizarre to me. Because if you love something, you should be able to criticize it.
I completely agree with you. I think we're living in a time when there's a real lack of nuance to what it means to be a fan or a citizen of a nation, for example, that you either have to be wholly, endorsing of their work and their project, or you're betraying it, or you're not worthy of it, or you hate it. There's no room for any nuance between those points. And I remember doing a book event for Dolls of Our Lives, and someone in the audience in the Q&A was like, don't you, basically I'm paraphrasing, but like, don't you think you're being mean to Valerie Tripp and Pleasant Rowland in your book? And the question just really stunned me, because I don't think that book is in any way unfair to either one of those people. And in fact, I think that the way to be a fan of something is to hold it to account. And I would imagine Valerie Tripp and others, maybe Janet Shaw, would look back on some of these original books and say, hey, you know what? I would do things differently now because I know better, I know differently, I've had access to more information. And for no other reason than if people came to them and said, as you said earlier, like, I'm harmed by this, please don't do this, they would take that seriously. Like, I'm going to give them that grace because they seem to be compassionate in how they've designed the brand. But it is stunning to me that a lot of fandoms can't withstand the smallest amount of criticism, even and especially if it's well-meaning. I mean, I don't think criticism can be bad if it's asking something to be more inclusive of people who want to be part of it.
And to grow, because all of us, isn't that what being a human is like to learn to live with other people and to expand within yourself and to grow and integrate like what you learn around you. And with Janet Shaw, I will say, like, she went on to write the Kaya books, which I think is really interesting. I also have, as you know, major problems with the Kaya books, but I wonder if part of that decision was her wanting to do something to make up for the way these books these books are terrible. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
I mean, no, I mean, there's so many moments in the 1986 book that really had me staring into space yesterday rereading it, because, there's a scene where when Singing Bird appears by the water, she's almost described as being startled like a deer. And in the whole first book, the first edition, it really reads like Janet Shaw is struggling to humanize her, to write about her as a little girl with the ease with which she seemingly does with Kirsten. And instead we get this sort of like Indigenous person equals animal formulation, which is not unique to this book, but really doesn't sit well 40 years later.
That's a really good point. And my wife and I have, we read together every night. And we recently have been reading the Richard Scarry biography. And, so they were talking about an interview we had where someone was saying, why are all of your characters animals? And he talks about how, like, it's easier for children to be able to feel okay about these silly situations, like Mr. Frumble's car crashes or someone's fallen out of a boat or the house is on fire. If it's animals, and that children relate really well to anthropomorphized animals. But I feel like for Indigenous people, the struggle is like, when do we get to become anthropomorphized? Because we're seen as animals and not fully human.
Yeah.
And no one seems to have a problem with that. I mean, the Children's Cooperative Book Center at UW-Madison puts out that graphic every year that shows like how many children's book protagonists are white, how many are of different racialized groups. And there are always more anthropomorphized animal protagonists than there are characters of color every year.
Yeah.
And yes, I agree with Richard Scarry. I think that it's great because kids can see the animal and see the humanity in the animal without having to deal with the parents or their own conceptions of racialization. But children who look like me aren't being represented in ways where they can see themselves in a positive light. Because here, this is one of the few examples of representation I had of an Indigenous girl in literature as a child. And almost every single time I encountered an Indigenous girl in fiction, those characters were written by white authors, and they were not well written, or the book would be very well written, but there's a lot of assumptions being made. I mean, you see things like Julie of the Wolves or Walk Two Moons, books that are celebrated and have these Newbery medals. There's more books, award-winning books about Native kids by white authors than there have ever been by Native authors. And I don't know, it's frustrating to me now that I'm in my 40s and I see like the children in my family. Like, I'm not a parent, right? But I see the young people in my family growing up, and I'm so happy for them in some senses. Like, I'm so happy that the relationship to queer identities is so much better than mine was as a kid in the 80s and 90s. But at the same time, these like horrible beliefs and conceptualizations of indigeneity persist. They're just, as in these two books, from my perspective, they're the way we describe them. It's insidious, it's shifting, it's coded. But if you're exposed to those microaggressions every day throughout your whole life, like as I am, you were able to recognize the microaggression, even in these texts that are supposedly fixing the situation.
That's really, I mean, it's really sad, but I'm wondering, how you're seeing the re-encoding of it happen. So how has it shifted? How does it look different for you now than, say, in the original Kirsten book?
Well, so here we've got, right, it's placing the blame on the government, right? So before, the Indians were the savages, and it was just kind of like in the milieu of, they're savages. Now we've got this kind of pitiful situation where they promised to pay the Dakota for their land. They made a treaty with the Dakota, right? So the government made the treaty with the Dakota. Even that sentence, it's not the government and the Dakota made a treaty. It's Miss Winston hit the stove, right? Make sure that the direct object of hit is not the student. And here it is. The direct object of the treaty is the Dakota. They were promised food and supplies, but the Dakota haven't received much. So again, it's a shifting of blame away from the settlers. Yes, there's more acknowledgement, but again, who made the treaty at whose behest? Right? And again, why did we have the American Revolution in the first place? Because of the merciless Indian savages.
Whew. Wow. You're really dropping a lot of knowledge on me, and I really appreciate that. And, also like that this may be a tough topic to discuss, but, I'm wondering if there's other things in your research that you want to share with us.
I mean, I think I could talk about this all day, right? I'm so passionate about this. I see the way that I was harmed as a child. And even though I've come to study this as my profession, like my area of interest, of research interest, is the way that we're imparting these ideas of nationalism and indigeneity through children's media, and not just to settler kids, but to new immigrant kids, to Indigenous kids, because we're all reading the same books, but who are we writing them to? It's not like the Indigenous kids are reading all of the, kids are reading each other's books, and that's how it should be. But I don't know, I guess one thing I wanted to bring up, I wrote it down and I forgot to say, was that as long as we're talking about commemorations, last year was the 100-year anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act. So Indigenous folks in the United States have only had the right to citizenship for 101 years.
That's crazy to think about.
So if we think about Singing Bird, even if she had a longer lifespan, which she likely didn't because of the Indigenous wars and being starved as a child, she probably would not have lived another 70 years to have ever experienced citizenship.
Wow, that's so sad. I mean, all of this kind of speaks to a lack of progress on things on which we dearly wish there would be progress. Or, I guess what's more insidious to your point about the revision is clearly the brand cares about being seen as having made progress without actually having done the work to manifest that, or kind of the work that has to happen behind the scenes. And it sort of leaves you thinking that this is, if not a PR move because they're not publicizing it, like something to help like drive sales.
I think maybe they initially intended to point to it and you know, and be more open about the revision they've done. Now they've done it, right? And they can say they did it if someone asks, but they don't have to. I mean, this like anti-DEI environment right now is vicious.
Yes. I was going to say, I mean, do you think that the Trump administration, the anti-DEI of it all, is going to impact how American Girl celebrates its 40th anniversary? Like how they tell the story of the brand and why it matters?
You know what? I think that's an incredibly profound question, right? Because it's so hard to know how they're going to thread this needle, which they've been doing for decades, right? They've got folks like us who really, the history really resonated with us and drove us to become critical of our nation and to learn more about like what actually was happening. What is the historical context that all of these fictional girls lived in? Mm-hmm. And then there are folks who take a very literalist interpretation of these stories. But all of us have some kind of relationship with these characters. And for me, I think one of the greatest gifts that you gave me, like over the course of listening to Dolls of Our Lives and just being friends with you, is just like, okay, it's okay for me to be this critical of something that I loved, because being part of this fandom for so long in different forums, you know, live journal, discords, host board, you know, AG Playthings and all the different pro boards and Reddit, in all of these environments, there is a very strong anti-Indigenous sentiment that hasn't shifted. Even in these spaces that are like so-called progressive, there's still a lot of anti-indigeneity there. And for me, like I found a lot of comfort in having friends like you that I can just be like, you know what, this is messed up. This is messed up. And I didn't see it when I was a child, but that doesn't mean that this can't shift now. It's not too late. And for a long time, you know, I've seen my own views on the way American Girl kind of interacts with indigeneity change over the years. As a child, I used to write letters to Pleasant Company, right, in Middleton, requesting that they have an Indigenous character. But now, you know, Kaya has been around more than 20 years. And what I see with Kaya being part of this American Girl canon is that American Girl chose a very stereotypical Plains-esque aesthetic. Kaya's got the horses, she's got the teepee, she's got the buckskin fringe and the 2 long braids and the feathers, and then even the powwow outfits of today, right, are a pan-Indian phenomenon and not specific to her tribe. So now I kind of, when I think about, when people in these communities are saying, like, we really need an Indigenous girl, we need an Indigenous girl, and I just don't think it's appropriate. When you go on eBay, when you go on Etsy, if you Google Native American girl, almost everything that comes up is disturbingly stereotypical. Or you're starting to see ribbon skirts that are being sold by non-Indigenous people. And that's not okay. Those are ceremonial garments. Those are clothing that have specific cultural meaning. And yes, they're beautiful. Of course people want to wear them, but there's a meaning behind them. And I think where we're going now is American Girl is just selling these like trappings of culture, but because they're primarily a toy company, they're not a story company. The story is kind of just like, it's the substrate that kind of allows them to sell what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you see the influence of Mattel kind of strongly coming in, is a move away from a real embrace of history and story, and that having meaning to how you tell the story of like dynamic characters, and you build out a world that, you know, has some thoughtfulness behind it, despite what we've said about Kirsten. I mean, I think in more recent years or with other characters, there was an attempt.
Claudia is excellent, I think.
Claudia is excellent. Oh my God, those books are incredible. Yes, I love those books. I used to say the Addie books were the best written, and I still love the Addie books, but Claudia is up there for me. I think it's tied for number one. Yes. I think they're phenomenally done. Like I could not be a bigger fan of those books, that whole project team, everything they did with the rollout. So it's like, I know it's possible because I've seen it. It's possible. You know, but then you see them also come out with like a Harry Potter collaboration, and I'm like, what are we doing here? That's where I'm like, I see you guys just trying to make money. at this point.
And I think that's part of the larger context of probably about the past 10-ish years. American Girl started bleeding money. They don't have the funds at hand any longer to do really in-depth and historical research. And that's why, you're seeing a lot of recycled IP. Like the Girl of the Year this year, she's great in terms of the anniversary, right? Because she's Samantha's descendant. And she's Mexican-American, so yay, she's diverse, and also a descendant of Samantha. Oh my, what would Grandmary think? But at the same time, they're really relying on trends. Like they're like the 90s girls reading their book. It's just like pop culture reference after pop cultural reference. And then the same thing with Courtney, the 80s doll. I think they're just, they don't have the capacity, or maybe it's hard for them to agree on how to approach history in a way that like really does right by the children who are reading these books, all of the children.
I think it's in it, what you're seeing with Courtney Forward is an embrace of nostalgia and a pivot from history. So history is something that we can use to understand our world and our place within it, and how people, understood this in the past, in their own moment. Nostalgia is an uncritical embrace of certain select elements of the past that make us feel good in the present. So I think that's how I would see what's happened with Courtney Forward. And with this most recent Girl of the Year, I actually think it's not great that the only way we can have a girl of color is if she's descended from a white ancestor that we already care about. Like, I don't know what that says about us or the brand. And I think, it depresses me to see them recycle so much IP, even as I guess they need to with the Wicked collab, the Clueless collaboration, even though I love Clueless. The most galling to me is the 50th or the original Barbie collaboration, which, Pleasant Rowland hated Barbie.
That was literally what she said, one of the reasons she founded the brand. And I'm not worshiping Kate Pleasant, but it is telling.
It's a huge tell. And look, she sold her brand to Mattel, whatever, but it's like she was motivated by what she saw as the hugely problematic sexualization of girls at a young age by the dolls that they were being offered on the marketplace, chief among them Barbie, which was copied from a mold of a German sex toy sold at truck stops. And that's the original Barbie that then gets like spun out by American Girl like this year or last year as one of their collectible dolls. And when I saw that, I was just kind of like, what? Like, I'm sorry. I would love to know how quickly Pleasant got on the phone and was like, what the hell is this? But
compartmentalized it. But when you mentioned Barbie, the original Barbie being sold at truck stops, Mimi, that's where most kids are getting Indigenous dolls. Truck stops and rest stops, they have those like little Indian girl dolls with the feather headband and the hot pinks, suede.
That's interesting. Wow. Yeah. I didn't make that connection. Wow. That's interesting.
And I think about like me as a kid, like, we would drive back and forth between the East Coast and Wisconsin and New Mexico almost every summer, multiple times. And I'd see those and I wanted them because to me, they were pretty.
Right.
Because even though I was Indigenous and like very strongly connected to my community and like raised in my language and our ways and our dances, like I still was surrounded by this messaging that like the pretty Indian girls are those girls, right? Who are not kids like me with like scabby knees and like chasing after dogs and, climbing up into tree houses. Like, no, it's like Tiger Lily or,
right. Those. Yeah. Wow.
And American Girl is kind of just moving in that same vein. And then you look at on Instagram, like all of these communities that have otherwise really progressive, like queer spaces, there's still this weird placement of indigeneity into this static past.
Yes. And, the lack of progress on that is upsetting. And I don't know what the answer is except to continually insist on history, and which is not designed to make you feel good. It's designed to make you ask questions, to understand like how we arrived at where we are now, no matter what the topic is, and not nostalgia. But because I think that what's driving that too is sort of the embrace of this caricature for which white people are nostalgic inexplicably and have no self-awareness about the harm it causes when they're either selling Indigenous clothing on eBay for American Girl dolls when they're white people who are not part of the community, or the Zach Morris episode of Saved by the Bell, which I do think you should watch at some point, if for no other reason than you'll laugh because it's insane.
I think we need to do like a watch party together.
I think we do. And I actually think that what we should do to start, because we're on this kick of talking about how people commemorate anniversaries and such things, is to get into the Ken Burns of it all.
I agree with you. But as we talk about, this new documentary coming out with, landmark changes in the way he works, with a lot more participation from Indigenous peoples and folks who are really negatively affected by the revolution, I do want to say that I want to acknowledge the 3 Indigenous people from Lakota and Dakota folks who worked with American Girl on the revision.
Please. Yes, please do.
And my critique of these revisions are not to say that I don't agree with those folks, but that as someone who sat on these advisory boards, it's often you can give the organization as much feedback as you can muster, but that doesn't mean they'll take it and they'll still put your name on it. And I'm not saying that's what happened here. I hope that, the 3 folks on the advisory committee, there's Amber Annis, who's a professor from Cheyenne River. She's Lakota. Cheyenne St. John, who's Dakota, and Joe Bendixson, who's from Siston-Wapton, Dakota, right? And one of those people isn't from a Dakota community, but is Lakota, which is affiliated. And I just hope that they're not experiencing any kind of negative backlash, because as someone who's like regularly called upon to consult in these spaces or to do this kind of work, institutions are mandated. Government-funded institutions are mandated to consult with tribes. They are not mandated to take those recommendations. So I just want to honor the work that those 3 people must have done. And I hope that they were really heard in a way that I also hope is coming forward in this new miniseries that you and I are both anticipating.
Yes, which we're talking about Ken Burns' The American Revolution documentary, which has just debuted. Commemorations are really wild to me, or sort of like memory politics. There's always we're choosing to remember this and not that.
Yeah.
And I think,
how do we remember?
How do we remember?
How are we remembering them? And what are we not recalling deliberately?
Yes, absolutely. And if you think that you have no relationship to this kind of history, think about your own family history, because I know in my family, people will so much of memory is rehearsed. And so people will be like, oh my God, remember that time grandma got drunk at Thanksgiving? And then as many times as that story is told, someone will be like, no, it wasn't grandma, it was you. And then you have to be like, wow, damn, was it me? Not speaking about me specifically, but, but it's contested. What gets remembered in the family history? What is erased on purpose? What is just sort of forgotten because the archive doesn't exist? Everyone has history in their own families and their own lives. And to see how we talk about kind of history within the nation framework, all of that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Also, just modalities of remembering, right? And I work with oral histories, and Indigenous history often is not considered to be real or trusted because a lot of it is oral. And and that's kind of privileging this written word, when I think we both know what you write down doesn't have to be true.
Definitely not. I mean, read a lot of history books. There's a lot out there that's written down that was not true. I mean, there's one of my favorite examples was told to me by a family member who grew up in the 60s and 70s. The history textbook he had growing up, when it described the Lincoln assassination, said, we never caught the guy who did it. Because there was a rumor that John Wilkes Booth was Catholic, and he was attending a Catholic school using a textbook for Catholic schools that refused to name him as Lincoln's murderer because it didn't want to associate Lincoln's assassination with a Catholic person.
And in the same way, we don't acknowledge Lincoln as ordering the largest mass execution in U.S. history of the Dakota 38, who were Singing Bird's relatives.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And that's not and it's not to say that our country, of course our country is flawed, but so is every country. And if we believe in this American project, I don't, but if you do, one of the most important things about being raised indigenously is that many of us are raised with a sense of responsibility, of community responsibility, which is in opposition to the way a lot of like settler culture thinks about my rights are, what are my rights? My rights, this is what I deserve, instead of how are we working together in community to make sure that everybody is healthy and growing to the best of the whole community's ability. And now, with SNAP gone and references to folks of color and queer folks being scrubbed out of National Park Service sites and textbooks and websites, those histories aren't disappearing. It's just now the responsibility of grassroots, individual people, individual families, organizations to keep the memories alive. And that's what history really is. When Indigenous people are claiming sovereignty, and we're talking about our sovereign right as domestic dependent nations, we're still under this mantle of the United States federal government. We're still beholden to that relationship. And that's really difficult for communities. There's 574 federally recognized tribes, plus state recognized tribes and unrecognized communities. And we are fighting to continue to be who we are. And we, there's that, people say we shall remain, right? But we do remain. And that's because our relationship to this land has been part of our lineage since time immemorial. And this nation, it's not going to be here forever, but I know my people are going to still be here. I don't know in what form we're going to be here, but our responsibility is to the land and the animals and each other, not to fleeting political regimes. And I hope that that's something that everybody in the US can come to understand, is that our responsibility is to each other.
That's exactly. What a great way to maybe go out on. I mean, what a great sentiment. I really do think community is everything, and it's how we're going to get through this time and all times. And, there's a real focus right now, or an interpretation of the United States government or the story of America that's really on individual enterprise. And I really don't buy into that, because as you say, I think the only way to get through anything is with each other, and for each other. And, so that's why I'm really happy that you could be on my first episode. And, you're a really big part of my community, and kind of bridging the stories that I wanted to tell about American Girl to this new space where we're going to be kind of exploring a lot of questions in pop culture and history, some silly, some not so silly. But, I just really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge with us.
I really appreciate that you continue to invite me to be part of this aspect of your life. It's an honor, and you always leave me being like, oh, I should have said that. Oh, and then I'll tell Vanessa, like, maybe made me think, like I feel like I really grow intellectually and emotionally just from getting to be around you. So thank you.
Thank you so much to my friend Colette for joining me, and thank you for listening. For more information on the show and to find the resources mentioned in this episode, check the show notes. There you'll also find the link to my Patreon, where you can find even more research, info, and hot takes. As a member of my Patreon, you'll get a weekly newsletter and bi-weekly episodes delivered to you all for free. For $5 a month, you can get a bonus episode, chat with other listeners about all things pop culture and history, suggest topics for future episodes, and more. It also helps support my work. Please tell a friend about the show and rate and review it wherever you listen to help me spread the word. You can follow me on Instagram at Mimi Mahoney, where my love language really is funny memes about Jessica Fletcher. Thanks for joining me, and I'll call again soon.